I still remember the exact moment my daughter stopped smiling, and it happened the second the lawyer said my name first. We were sitting in a quiet office on the third floor of a brick building in downtown Hartford, Connecticut, the kind of place with tall windows and shelves full of thick legal books that no one ever seems to open anymore. My daughter Ashley had walked in ahead of me that morning wearing a cream-colored coat and the confident expression of someone who believed the future was already hers. She had even offered to drive me there, something she rarely did, insisting it would be easier for both of us if we arrived together. I didn't argue. At 68, I've learned that sometimes the quietest moments reveal the loudest truths. The lawyer, David Collins, greeted us with a polite nod and gestured toward two leather chairs across from his desk. Ashley sat down immediately, crossing her legs and placing her designer handbag carefully on the floor beside her. I noticed the way she glanced around the office, not with curiosity, but with expectation, as if the room itself were simply a formality before something she had already decided belonged to her. Mr. Collins opened a folder and adjusted his glasses. The air in the room felt strangely still, the way it does right before a summer thunderstorm rolls across the fields outside town. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the faintest smile playing at the corner of her lips. If you had walked in at that moment, you might have thought we were two women sharing a simple appointment together, a mother and daughter taking care of paperwork. But the truth is more complicated than that, and I suppose it always had been. When Ashley was little, she used to run across the backyard of our house on Maple Street chasing fireflies on warm July nights. Her father would stand on the porch laughing while I held a glass jar for her to collect them. Back then, I believed I had raised a kind and thoughtful girl, the sort of daughter who would grow into someone who cared about family more than anything else. For many years, I never questioned that belief. But life has a way of slowly revealing things we wish weren't true. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic moment, no shouting, no terrible argument that shattered everything in a single day. Instead, the change crept in quietly after my husband, Robert, passed away 3 years ago. At first, Ashley simply asked practical questions, the kind of things any adult child might ask when a parent becomes widowed. She wanted to know if I was comfortable managing the house by myself, whether the mortgage had been fully paid off, and how the insurance policies were structured. At the time, I assumed she was worried about me. I even felt grateful that she seemed so attentive. But the questions kept coming, little by little, always circling back to the same things. The house, the savings account Robert and I had built over 40 years, and the retirement fund we had carefully planned down to the last dollar. Eventually, I began to notice something subtle in the way she asked them. It wasn't concern. It was calculation. Still, I said nothing. I simply watched and listened. And that is why, on that quiet Tuesday morning in the lawyer's office, I was not surprised when Mr. Collins finally opened the folder and began reading the document aloud. What surprised me was Ashley's face. Because the moment he spoke the first line, the smile she had been holding onto all morning disappeared completely. For a long time I believed I understood my daughter better than anyone else in the world. When Ashley was growing up in our small neighborhood on Maple Street, she was the kind of child who brought home stray kittens and begged me to keep them. She used to sit at the kitchen table after school with her homework spread out in front of her, tapping her pencil against her notebook while she tried to solve math problems that her father had already explained twice. Robert would stand behind her chair with his hands on her shoulders and say that patience was the most valuable thing a person could learn. Ashley always laughed when he said that because patience was never one of her strengths. She was bright and determined, the kind of girl who wanted everything figured out immediately. When she was 16 years old, she told us she would one day run her own business. Robert was proud of that confidence. He used to tell our friends that Ashley had the kind of drive that could carry her anywhere she wanted to go. For many years I believed that too. Even after she left home and moved across the state for college, she still called every Sunday afternoon like clockwork. Sometimes the conversations were short, but she always asked how we were doing and whether the garden behind the house was still producing tomatoes in the summer. When she married her husband Daniel 10 years ago, Robert and I stood together at the reception hall watching them dance under strings of white lights. Robert squeezed my hand and whispered that we had done something right raising her. I remember feeling a quiet sense of relief hearing him say that. Parenting never comes with a manual, and most of the time you simply hope the lessons you try to teach will stay with your children when they become adults. For many years Ashley seemed exactly like the daughter we thought we had raised. She visited on holidays, brought small gifts on birthdays, and spoke about her plans for the future with the same excitement she had as a teenager. But after Robert passed away, something changed in ways that were subtle enough to ignore at first. During the weeks after the funeral, Ashley stayed at the house helping me sort through paperwork and old photographs. At least that was how it appeared on the surface. One evening while we sat at the dining room table, she asked whether I had considered selling the house someday. I told her I had not thought about it yet because the place held too many memories. Robert had built the wooden deck himself 30 years earlier, and every board still carried the marks of his careful work. Ashley nodded politely when I explained that, but the conversation did not end there. Over the following months she began asking more questions about the financial details of our lives. She wanted to know whether the mortgage had been completely paid off, and whether Robert had left behind any investment accounts. At first I answered without hesitation because I assumed she was concerned about my stability living alone. But there was something in her tone that gradually began to feel different. It was not worry. It was curiosity that lingered a little too long on numbers and ownership and future plans. I told myself I was imagining things. A mother does not easily believe that. Her own child might see her life as a calculation. Yet the more Ashley visited, the more I began to notice that our conversations always circled back to the same subject. What would eventually happen to everything Robert and I had spent 40 years building together? The questions did not stop after that first conversation at the dining room table. In fact, they became more frequent, and each one seemed to arrive wrapped in the same careful tone of concern that made it difficult to challenge. A few weeks later Ashley visited again on a Sunday afternoon while the autumn wind moved through the tall maple trees behind the house. She walked through the living room slowly, her eyes lingering on the furniture Robert and I had collected over decades. At one point she paused near the window and asked whether I had ever considered downsizing to something smaller, maybe a condominium closer to the city. I told her that the house was nearly 2,800 square feet and yes, it was more space than I needed, but every corner of it carried a memory. The hallway still held the pencil marks on the wall where we had measured Ashley's height every birthday. The kitchen cabinet still had the small brass handles Robert installed himself one winter when he decided the old ones were worn out. Ashley nodded while I spoke, but her attention seemed to drift back toward the large windows that overlooked the backyard. Finally she asked how much the house might be worth in the current market. I remember answering casually because property values had been discussed all over the news at the time. I told her that a real estate agent had once estimated it might sell for around $620,000 depending on renovations. Ashley did not respond immediately. Instead she gave a small thoughtful nod, as if she were quietly calculating something in her mind. After that afternoon the conversations began to follow a pattern I could not ignore. Ashley would visit with a pie from the bakery or a bouquet of flowers from the grocery store, and somewhere between polite conversation and coffee at the kitchen table she would return to the same subjects. She asked about the retirement account Robert and I had built over 40 years of steady work. She asked whether I had updated the insurance policies since Robert passed away. One evening she even asked whether I had written a new will yet. That question stayed with me longer than the others. Most people do not bring up wills during casual visits unless there is a reason. When I asked why she was curious, Ashley smiled and said she only wanted to make sure everything would be simple for the family someday. On the surface it sounded responsible, yet something about the way she said it made the room feel colder than before. I began to notice that she rarely asked about how I was truly doing emotionally after losing Robert. She did not ask whether the nights felt lonely or whether the quiet house was difficult to manage. Her attention always drifted back to numbers and documents and ownership. One afternoon she even suggested that I consider placing her name on certain accounts, so she could help manage them if anything happened to me. I thanked her for the suggestion but told her I was still perfectly capable of handling my own affairs. Ashley laughed politely when I said that, yet the laugh did not reach her eyes. That was when a quiet realization began to settle in my mind. My daughter was not simply curious about my well-being. She was trying to understand exactly when and how everything I owned might eventually become hers. The moment that finally changed everything did not happen during one of Ashley's polite visits at the kitchen table. It happened on a quiet evening in early spring when the air outside still carried the chill of winter. Ashley and her husband Daniel had come over for dinner, something they had started doing every few weeks since Robert passed away. I remember that night clearly because I had cooked one of Robert's favorite meals, roasted chicken with potatoes and green beans, the same recipe I had made for decades. The three of us sat together in the dining room, and for a while the conversation stayed comfortably ordinary. Daniel talked about a project at work. Ashley mentioned a weekend trip they were planning, and I listened while clearing the plates after dinner. Eventually Ashley stood up and offered to help me bring the dishes into the kitchen. I told her she could leave them because I would take care of everything later, but she insisted with a smile that seemed almost overly cheerful. Daniel stayed behind in the dining room scrolling through something on his phone while Ashley followed me down the short hallway toward the kitchen. At first we spoke about small things, the kind of quiet conversation that happens naturally while washing dishes. She dried the plates with a dish towel while I rinsed them in warm water. But after a few minutes Ashley said she needed to step outside to take a quick phone call. She walked through the back door that led to the wooden deck Robert had built years ago. I finished washing the last plate and wiped my hands on a towel before walking toward the door to close it. That was when I heard Ashley's voice drifting back inside from the deck. She had not realized I was standing close enough to hear her. At first I did not pay attention because it sounded like an ordinary conversation, but then a few words reached me clearly through the cool evening air. Ashley was speaking with Daniel, who had apparently stepped outside through the front door to join her. I could not see them from where I stood, but their voices carried easily across the quiet backyard. Ashley said that the house was probably worth more than $600,000 now because property values had gone up in the last year. Daniel asked whether I had mentioned selling it anytime soon. Ashley gave a short laugh before answering in a tone I had never heard from her before. She said there was no reason to rush because eventually the house would belong to them anyway. There was a brief pause and then she added that once everything was settled they could renovate the kitchen and list the property for a much higher price. I remember standing there in the dim light of the hallway, holding the dish towel in my hands while the meaning of those words slowly settled in my mind. Ashley was not talking about some distant possibility decades in the future. She was speaking as though my life were simply a timeline she was waiting to reach the end of. The quiet confidence in her voice told me something even more troubling. She truly believed the future of this house and everything inside it had already been decided. For several minutes after hearing those words I did not move from the hallway. The house was completely quiet except for the faint sound of Ashley and Daniel talking outside on the deck. I could not hear every sentence, but I heard enough to understand what they believed. In their minds the future had already been arranged, and my life was simply the last detail standing between them and the plans they had started to imagine. I remember walking slowly back into the kitchen and placing the dish towel neatly beside the sink as if nothing unusual had happened. When Ashley and Daniel returned a few minutes later, I greeted them the same way I always did. I asked whether they wanted coffee before leaving and listened politely, while they talked about traffic on the highway and a new restaurant that had opened downtown. Ashley even smiled at me as she thanked me for dinner, the same warm expression she had shown countless times before. If I had not heard that conversation outside, I might have believed every word of her kindness. That night after they drove away, I sat alone in the living room with the lights turned low and the quiet ticking of the old clock Robert had hung on the wall 20 years earlier. I thought about everything Ashley had said during the past year, every question about bank accounts, property values, and documents I had once answered without hesitation. When I placed those memories beside the conversation I had overheard, the pattern became impossible to ignore. My daughter was not simply curious about my future. She was planning her own. The realization did not make me angry the way some people might expect. Instead, it brought a strange calm that settled slowly over my thoughts. At 68 years old, I had lived long enough to understand that people reveal their true intentions when they believe no one is listening. Ashley thought the future of this house was already written. She believed the money Robert and I had saved during 4 decades of careful work would eventually fall into her hands without question. What she did not realize was that the future is never guaranteed to follow the path someone else imagines. The next morning I woke early, made a cup of coffee, and sat at the small table near the kitchen window where Robert used to read the newspaper every Sunday. The sun was just beginning to rise above the trees behind the backyard, casting a pale golden light across the wooden deck where I had heard that conversation the night before. I sat there quietly for a long time thinking about Robert and the promises we had made to each other when we first started building our life together. We had always believed that responsibility meant protecting what you worked for, even when the decisions were not easy. By the time the clock on the wall struck 8 in the morning, I had already made up my mind about what needed to happen next. Later that afternoon, I picked up the telephone and called the office of David Collins, the same attorney who had handled several legal matters for our family years earlier. When his assistant answered, I asked whether Mr. Collins might have time to meet with me sometime during the week. She offered an appointment for the following Tuesday morning. I thanked her politely and wrote the time down on a small notepad beside the phone. Then I hung up and looked around the quiet house Robert and I had built together, knowing that the future Ashley expected was about to change in a way she would never see coming. The following Tuesday morning arrived with the quiet steadiness of an ordinary day, the kind of morning that would not seem important to anyone else but meant everything to me. I woke early, long before the traffic began moving through the streets of Hartford, and prepared a simple breakfast of toast and coffee. The house was silent except for the familiar ticking of the clock in the living room and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. For a moment I stood by the window looking out across the backyard where the grass was still damp with morning dew. The wooden deck Robert built more than 30 years ago looked exactly the same as it always had, strong and steady, just like the life we had built together. That thought reminded me why the appointment I had scheduled mattered so much. After finishing my coffee, I put on a navy blue coat and drove downtown to the brick building where David Collins kept his office. The drive took about 15 minutes, passing the same streets I had traveled countless times over the years. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to take a seat in the waiting area. A few minutes later, Mr. Collins stepped out of his office with a warm but professional smile. He had a calm presence about him, the kind that made people feel comfortable discussing serious matters without pressure. We sat down across from each other at a large wooden desk, and he asked how I had been managing since Robert passed away. I told him the truth, that the house still felt quiet without my husband, but that I had learned how to keep moving forward one day at a time. After a few minutes of conversation, he gently asked what had brought me in that morning. I paused for a moment before answering because I wanted to choose my words carefully. I explained that I wished to review the will Robert and I had prepared years earlier and possibly make some changes. Mr. Collins nodded and retrieved a folder from his cabinet. Inside were the documents we had signed nearly 15 years ago when Ashley was still in her 20s. At that time, the plan had seemed simple and natural. Everything we owned would eventually pass to our daughter. That was what most parents expected when they spent a lifetime building a stable future for their family. Mr. Collins asked whether something specific had prompted my decision to reconsider the arrangement. I did not share every detail of the conversation I had overheard on the deck because I did not need to explain my daughter's intentions in order to protect what Robert and I had worked for. Instead, I told him that life circumstances sometimes reveal new truths about people, and that I wanted to make certain our savings and our home would be handled responsibly for years to come. He listened carefully without interrupting, occasionally nodding as he understood what I was saying without needing further explanation. Then he asked me a simple question that carried more weight than it appeared on the surface. He asked what outcome I believed would best honor the work my husband and I had spent 4 decades building together. I thought about that question for several seconds before answering. I told him that I wanted to ensure the house remained protected during my lifetime, and that the larger portion of our savings should support something meaningful long after I was gone. Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair thoughtfully before explaining several legal options that could accomplish exactly that. By the time our meeting ended nearly an hour later, the future Ashley believed was waiting for her had quietly taken a very different shape. After that meeting with David Collins, the days returned to their usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Spring slowly moved into early summer, and the maple trees behind the house filled out with thick green leaves that cast soft shadows across the backyard in the afternoon. From the outside, nothing in my life appeared different. I continued watering the small garden Robert and I had planted years ago, and I still drove to the grocery store every Saturday morning just as I always had. Ashley visited from time to time as well, often bringing pastries from a bakery near her home, or a small bouquet of flowers she picked up along the way. If anyone had watched those visits, they might have believed everything between us was perfectly normal. I welcomed her into the house, we sat together at the kitchen table, and we talked about ordinary things like the weather or a movie she had recently watched with Daniel. Yet beneath those simple conversations there was now a quiet understanding that only I carried. I knew exactly what Ashley believed the future held, and I also knew how carefully she was trying to make sure nothing disturbed that expectation. One Sunday afternoon she mentioned again that the real estate market in Hartford had become extremely competitive, and that houses like mine were selling quickly for impressive prices. She said it casually while stirring sugar into her coffee, as though it were simply an interesting fact she had heard on the news. I nodded politely and said the neighborhood had always been desirable, because of the large yards and quiet streets. Ashley smiled in agreement, but then asked whether I had thought any more about simplifying my life by moving into a smaller place closer to town. I told her I was still comfortable exactly where I was. The conversation drifted to another subject after that, but I noticed the slight pause in her expression before she changed topics. It was the look of someone adjusting their expectations rather than abandoning them. Weeks passed in this quiet pattern. Ashley remained patient, confident that time itself would eventually deliver what she believed was already promised. Meanwhile, the documents David Collins had prepared moved steadily through the proper legal steps. I visited his office twice more to review the details and sign the necessary papers. Each time he explained the structure carefully so there would be no confusion later. The house on Maple Street would remain under my full control for the rest of my life through a protected legal trust. After my passing, the property would not automatically transfer to Ashley the way it once would have. Instead, the proceeds from any eventual sale would support a scholarship fund in Robert's name for students from the local high school who wanted to pursue careers in engineering, the field Robert had loved for most of his life. A smaller portion of our savings would still go to Ashley, because I had never intended to erase my daughter from the future entirely. But the greater part of what Robert and I built would now serve a purpose that extended far beyond one person's expectations. When the final documents were complete, David Collins placed them carefully into a secure file and told me that everything was legally arranged. Walking back to my car that afternoon, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. I had not confronted Ashley, and I had not spoken a single angry word about what I heard that night on the deck. Instead, I had simply ensured that the future would unfold according to the values Robert and I believed in, not according to the assumptions someone else had quietly begun to make. By the time autumn arrived again, the air around Maple Street had begun to carry the familiar scent of fallen leaves and cool evening wind. Nearly 6 months had passed since my meetings with David Collins, and during that time life continued moving forward in the quiet way it always had. Ashley still visited every few weeks, sometimes alone and sometimes with Daniel, always carrying the same confident ease she had shown since the night I overheard that conversation on the deck. She spoke about future vacations, about renovations they hoped to make to their own home someday, and occasionally she mentioned how fortunate it was that our neighborhood remained one of the most valuable areas in Hartford. Each time she said those things, I listened calmly, stirring my tea or wiping the kitchen counter. While she talked, I never challenged her assumptions because there was no reason to. The arrangements had already been made, the documents carefully signed and filed, and the future she believed was waiting had quietly shifted into something entirely different. One afternoon in late October, Ashley called and asked if we could meet the following week at David Collins's office. She explained that Daniel had recently spoken with a financial planner, who suggested it might be wise for families to review estate documents together, to avoid confusion later in life. Ashley said it in a cheerful voice, as though she were offering a helpful suggestion for everyone's peace of mind. I agreed without hesitation because I understood exactly why she believed that meeting would confirm everything she had been expecting. The morning of the appointment arrived with a gray sky and a steady wind moving through the streets of downtown Hartford. When I stepped into the familiar brick building, Ashley and Daniel were already waiting in the reception area. Ashley greeted me with a bright smile and a quick hug before we followed the receptionist down the hallway toward Mr. Collins's office. As we sat down across from his desk, I noticed the quiet confidence in Ashley's posture. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and leaned forward slightly, the same way she had months earlier when she believed the future was already arranged in her favor. David Collins opened a folder and adjusted his glasses before speaking. He explained that the purpose of the meeting was simply to review the current estate structure, so that everyone clearly understood how things were organized moving forward. Ashley nodded with polite interest, occasionally glancing toward Daniel as if sharing a silent reassurance that everything would soon be confirmed exactly the way they expected. Then Mr. Collins began reading through the documents in his calm professional voice. The first section described the protected trust that held ownership of the Maple Street property during my lifetime. Ashley's expression remained relaxed at first, perhaps assuming this was merely a technical detail before the larger distribution was explained. But as Mr. Collins continued outlining the structure of the trust and the long-term plans for Robert's scholarship fund, I noticed something subtle shift in the room. Ashley's smile slowly faded as the meaning of each sentence became clearer. She straightened slightly in her chair, her eyes moving from the lawyer to me as though searching for some explanation that had not yet been spoken. In that quiet office filled with shelves of legal books and soft afternoon light, the future she had imagined for so long was finally being replaced by the reality Robert and I had chosen to leave behind. The silence in David Collins's office grew heavier with each sentence he read from the documents resting on his desk. Ashley's confident expression had slowly disappeared, replaced by a look I had never seen on her face before. She sat very still, her eyes fixed on the folder in front of the lawyer as though she was trying to process every word at once. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair beside her, clearly realizing that the explanation unfolding in that quiet room was not matching the future they had imagined. David Collins continued speaking in the same calm professional tone he had used from the beginning. He explained that the Maple Street house would remain under my full control for the rest of my life through the legal trust we had established earlier that year. He described how the property could not be sold or transferred without my direct decision, and how the structure ensured that the home Robert built would remain protected as long as I was alive. Ashley finally spoke then, her voice careful but noticeably different from the confidence she had carried into the room. She asked whether that arrangement meant the house would automatically transfer to her later. David Collins paused briefly before answering in the same steady voice that had guided the entire meeting. He explained that after my lifetime the property would become part of a charitable trust created in Robert's name, supporting scholarships for students from the Hartford public schools who wanted to pursue engineering careers. The room remained quiet for several seconds after those words were spoken. I could see Ashley turning slightly toward me, her expression searching for some reaction that might explain what she had just heard. But there was nothing dramatic about the moment. I simply met her eyes with the same calm I had carried with me since the morning I called David Collins months earlier. Daniel cleared his throat softly and asked whether any portion of the estate had been left to family members. David Collins nodded and explained that a smaller portion of the financial assets would still pass to Ashley in the future, ensuring that she remained part of the family legacy Robert and I had built together. However, the majority of our savings and the long-term value of the property would now support the scholarship program that carried Robert's name forward. Ashley did not interrupt again after that. She sat quietly as the final details were explained, her posture no longer leaning forward with expectation but resting back against the chair, as if the energy had slowly drained from the assumptions she once carried so confidently. When the meeting ended, we all stood from our chairs and exchanged polite words the same way people do at the conclusion of any formal appointment. There were no raised voices and no accusations. Outside the building, the autumn wind moved through the streets of downtown Hartford, scattering a few dry leaves across the sidewalk as I walked toward my car. I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me in that moment. Robert and I had spent 40 years building a life based on responsibility, patience, and careful planning. The future now reflected those same values, not the expectations someone else had quietly begun to count on. And as I drove home through the familiar streets toward the house on Maple Street, I realized that sometimes the most powerful decisions are the ones made calmly, long before anyone else understands that the future has already changed.